So I came down last night and did all of the milling for this next project. This project, we're going to build this walnut bench that hopefully you can see now. And I decided to do the milling off screen because it can be a little bit tedious and repetitive. And I don't know how many shots of the planer and jointer I can put you through, but for me it's a very cathartic process. So after work on Friday, came down here, milled everything up. So I have rough cut 4 legs, 2 panels for the top, and then several pieces for the apron and the stretchers and the cross members and bracing. I thought about doing mortise and tenon on this for a lot of the joints, but I have a Domino, and so I figured I may as well use it as I have it. But you can totally do this with Dominos or dowels or mortise and tenons or a gazillion different ways to do the joinery, but I will be using my Domino in this one. So yeah, let's get on with it. So I mentioned the Domino there because I know it tends to turn people off from videos, because it's an extremely expensive piece of equipment that does one job. But that being said, I was able to afford one last year, so it makes sense to use it if you have it, right? First things first, let's take that rough lumber that I milled up the day before and cut it down to pretty much the final size for most of the parts. There were a few, such as the tops, that still needed to be cut down further, but with the legs and the stretchers, I cut them pretty close to the final size. I then mark out all of the joinery that I need to do on the legs and the base. And that essentially is marking out where I want the dominoes to go. The domino is super easy once you have it set up, so take a minute, mark out where you're going to put your dominoes, and make sure you mark your reference faces. Otherwise, things can get up getting a little off pretty quickly. And then, yeah, use the domino. It's such a huge time saver with joints like this to be able to use the domino. I could have done this with the drill press and then made some tenons, or I could have just done regular mortise and tenon, but I figured, again, have this toy, may as well use it. These little hold down clamps that I got for the dog holes look really nice, but I find them to be insanely finicky when using them. Although clearly I've not adjusted that properly and there's way too much clamping pressure. After putting in the mortises, I then mark all of the stretchers and legs for the half lap joints that I'm going to use for the aprons. I think that's what they're called. Then I need to change out the blade on the table saw to a Dado Stack, which is bizarrely easy on these saw stop tables. Just got to switch over those cartridges to make sure that you don't chop your finger off on the Dado Stack. You also need a second insert. You need a second one of these so that it sits nice and flush with the Dado Stack. Okay, next up, set the height of the Dado Stack. I use my adjustable T-square for this. And then I set the stop block on my miter fence exactly where I want it. And start using the Dado Stack to cut out the half lap joints. The key I learned with half laps joints doing this is to take out your initial cut, and then you're going to want to take your time sneaking up on the width of the cut. taking it over to the piece, testing frequently, coming back and using really high-tech shims like I did there, which were a couple of invoices and maybe a piece of scrap paper. And as you can see, after a little trial and error, they fit pretty nicely. So over for the first part of sanding on this puppy. We begin with the usual 80, 120 and 150 on everything. I water pop everything at least once, but some of the pieces I did in between every grit. I can't remember off the top of my head. So with these stretchers and supports, I think I only want to water pop them once. I then take my freshly sharpened block plane and add a bevel to pretty much every corner. I could have done this with the router, but I recently spent a minute or 10 sharpening the blades of everything I own, and so I'm using it. Now it's time for a glue up, and I already have the dominoes pre-made. I mean, you can make your own. I just have mine from last time, and I'm using a mallet that I built a couple of videos ago. This glue up is pretty easy and simple. It doesn't take too long, and so I'm not rushing or panicking, especially because there are only really 4 points that need to be glued. Probably the trickiest part of this is keeping it square, which you'll see in a minute. When I initially glued it up, it wasn't square, so I grabbed a nice long pipe clamp and fixed it across the corners. Just add a tiny little bit of pressure just to pull it back into square. Then back over to the other half of the half lap joints on the stretchers, and with these I went super slowly, again testing, going back, taking a little bit more off, going back, testing until I got the exact fit that I wanted. As part of the design that was in my head, I didn't know if I should go with a shelf at the bottom or no shelf. I think initially I decided no shelf, and then I ended up putting a shelf in. I felt it would make it a little bit more stable, prevent any kind of racking, and now I just have to decide solid shelf, slatted shelf. Do I go with maple, which I have resting on there now, or do I go with walnut and keep it a one species of wood build? Yeah, I've always found that building is the best way for me to figure out the design as I go. So I'm just going to carry on building and then, yeah, see what I come up with. And here I was definitely a little hasty. I decided to go ahead and glue up the base. In hindsight, I would have cut these stretchers to the correct length using the table saw. I may even have put an angle on it, but because I was rushing and I'm an idiot, then I had to use a good old-fashioned handsaw, which is no problem. I got this cut nice and square, and I could even have done an angle if I wanted, but it would have been so much easier had I cut this on the table saw before gluing it together. The lesson learned, as Chris Solomon from Four Eyes always talks about, order of operations is insanely important. So here I would say, do as I say, not as I do. Now, back to the top of the bench. On the top of the bench, I want to put a profiled edge on it, so I decided to put a big chamfer on the bottom. Well, the biggest router bit I had at least, and on the top, I'm going to do a very shallow angle chamfer, but I'll use the table saw for that, which you'll see in a minute. I promise I keep working towards getting better dust collection, and I think this 4-inch hose mounted underneath did something. I mean, I guess I can kind of see some bits of dust going in there, but it's not great. Maybe it needs to be closer to whatever I'm routing. I'm going to keep trying because this router creates so much dust, so much fine dust as well. It is not fun to work with at times. Back to that block plane, and as you can see in here, that thing is sharp, unlike me, and it takes off some nice long shavings, adding that little 45-degree chamfer to the edge also. Then I take one side of the bench up to the table saw, and using the dado stack that I left in there, I decide to slowly creep up on this dado. I take it over, test for width, come back and take a little bit more off. After I've done that, I then move the dado up and I take off the second cut so that it's the right depth. This little recess sits around the bench leg, and I want it like 1/8 of an inch bigger than the leg, so that there's this little negative recess around the leg. And this is the final dimension of one part of the top of the bench. There's a little gap in between them, so I need to cut these down to the final width. That offcut will come in very handy later on for a jig that I use. And now I'm using this extra tall fence on my table saw, which I bring up as high as it'll go, and then I lean it over 2-3 degrees, not much at all. All I'm trying to do is add a bit of a profile to the top of the bench. You can see using the fence makes this cut a lot safer, as you wouldn't want to be trying to balance that against a short fence and trying to push it through. So next up, I take it over and try and sand away some of those blade marks. It's definitely burnt a little bit in places, but it wasn't too bad. There's a little ridge that I had to get rid of, but 20 to 30 minutes with some 80 grit sandpaper and suddenly it was super smooth. Using some nice sharp hand chisels, although these could probably have been sharper actually, I decided to put a profile on the top of the legs. I thought about using the block plane, but on this end grain I think I just have more control with the chisel. Okay, so I didn't get through the video without the gratuitous shot of the jointer. And here it is. I ended up choosing to do maple for the shelf on the bench, and then not only maple, but I went with the maple slats, which then meant I needed to rip down this curly maple that I purchased. And I actually had to take the maple to a place called Creative Woodworks in Portland, and they were able to resaw it for me, so I didn't have to waste too much. Talking of that, I get my lumber from a variety of different places. This build has lumber from Windwood, who's a local sawyer. So yeah, I suppose he mills a bunch of wood, kiln dries it, and sells it on a fairly small scale. But some of the quality of the wood is insane. And that's where I got the walnut from. I got this maple from Woodcrafters, and I use a company called Creative Woodworking for some of the services that I can't do at home, such as resawing. So I decided slats it is, milled up, made some slats, and I also then came across another hurdle, how to attach them. In doing some brainstorming on that, I came up with the idea of making a jig, because we all know how much I love making jigs. So I made a jig for some dowels that I then placed on top of these rails, I think they're called, and evenly spaced them out. I used a calculator online to figure out the spacing based off the length of the rail and the width and how many, etc., etc. So these are all done. I'm going to show you how I did that now, or in a second, and then I will start gluing these up. Actually, before I glue them, I think I'm going to finish everything separately. So I'll do one coat of Osmo X on the slats, on the base, and on the top, and then I will attach them afterwards. I'm still going through ways to attach the top, but I think I'm also going to use dowels, dowel it on one edge, give it room to expand. But yeah, so I'm going to finish first and then assemble right at the very end. So on to final finishing, I guess. Okay, with that offcut from making the top the correct width, I'm able to make a jig so that I can mark out where the dowel spaces are going to be for attaching all of these slats. So I mark everything out at like 35 or 36 millimeter centers. I tend to flip-flop between millimeters and inches depending on what is easier to read, and then run it over to the drill press. This is actually the first time I get to use my drill press jig. And then back to the bench, using the blue painter's tape to hold it onto the stretcher so that I can mark out where I want to put the dowels. I use a bit of tape around a drill bit so I know just how far down I want to drill, so that the drill doesn't go too far but also goes far enough. And then I essentially use the holes to line up all of my doweling holes and speed right through. Like a machine. Once I've done the front lineup of the holes, it's onto the back, and then before attaching the slats, I want to put one coat of Osmo on them. So this is Osmo X. This is my first time using it. I'm applying one layer, wait for it to dry a little, come back with a clean shop towel and wipe off any excess. It's a hard wax oil, so a little bit goes a long way. And I found that hard wax oils give me the best results for me, or at least my personal aesthetic. I also wanted to apply finish before gluing things together because, you know, the base is an awkward shape. And so trying to get into some of these nooks and crannies and applying this oil would have been an absolute nightmare had I already had all of it assembled. After applying a coat of oil to the base and then wiping off any excess, I add all of the dowels and then tap them all in. These I'm going to use to attach all of the slats, as you'll see.
Wasn't some FCU operative who might or might not be able to tell him details of the events that he spent over a decade hoping to someday understand and exact retribution for? No.
Add a little bit of glue to the holes in the slats and then locate them and push down. I apologize for my audiobook that you can hear right now, but you know, it's what I do to keep myself mentally engaged while I'm working. Currently listening to one of the books from the Grey Man series. Highly recommend.
Not hesitate. I have to kill him. Trust me. This dude has it coming.
Okay, back to the slats.
Pause on the other
I
side.
just put a tiny little dab in each hole, as you can see, and then they locate perfectly, which keeps them all in line and means they have identical spacing in between.
Vehicle lock on enemy aircraft initiated. And then lock on acquired. Almost instantly, the speed and trajectory of the case. After zipping it shut and leaving it on the bed, she tossed the toiletries arrayed around her messy bag into her shoulder.
One last wipe down of any excess finish that is on the bench tops, and then I will affix these also with a dowel. All that's left to do is stare at it. Before you stare at it, a quick check-in with Hank, who's in quality control, and then time to stare at it. And until next time, peace.